Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Sorry. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone, virtually to the University of California Center Sacramento's event on how election reforms, participation trends, and COVID-19 will shape California's 2020 election. My name is Thad Kauser. I'm a professor of political science at UC San Diego. And along with UC Davis professor Cheryl Boudreau, I'm the co-editor of a special issue of the new California Journal of Politics and Policy special issue on this topic. Thanks so much for being part of this event. And we're thrilled today to bring together two of California's leading policymakers in the realm of elections, Assemblymember Mark Berman and State Senator Tom Umberg, with leading scholars of elections in the Golden State, and with all of you for a discussion. Now, this year's election, which is already well underway, will be historic as lawmakers, elections officials, and community organizations adapt to the challenge of voting during a pandemic while ensuring that Californians from every type of background have the opportunity to cast their ballot this year. Studying these adaptations and their impact is the focus of a special edition of the California Journal Politics and Policy that was just released today. All of the articles that you're going to hear about are now posted on the CJPP's website. So just Google California Journal of Politics and Policy, and you'll find this open access UC resource where you can read each of these articles. What we have includes commentaries from four policymakers. So we have Assemblymember Berman, Senator Umberg and Jonathan Diaz-Rivera of the Hastings Law, Senator Ben Allen, and the voting rights team at the ACLU of California. We also have 7 peer-reviewed pieces from political scientists at the University of California campuses and at the University of Southern California. And what we're going to do today is start with a keynote address from our two policymakers, first Assemblymember Berman, then Senator Umberg. Then we'll go into a panel of academic leaders, Cheryl Boudreau and Ben Heyton of UC Davis, Jessica Tronstein of UC Merced, Jennifer Marola of UC Riverside, and Mindy Romero of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC. They're going to release new survey results on how Californians viewed the adaptations that the state is making to holding an election during a pandemic, and presenting some summaries of the forthcoming articles in the CJPP. And then we're going to open it up to an audience Q&A, and you'll be able to ask questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom to any of the speakers. So we're going to start today, and we're so thrilled to have Assemblymember Mark Berman. He was first elected to the California Assembly in November of 2016 to represent the 24th District, which is in the heart of Silicon Valley. In his first 3 years in the Assembly, Mark has had one of the highest rates of success in the legislature, authoring legislation related to a number of issues, including elections, the 2020 census, education, youth mental health, sexual assault, firearm safety, deepfakes, housing, and the environment. Mark has sent 47 bills to the governor in just 3 years in office. And now he serves as chair of the Committee on Elections and Redistricting in the Assembly, where he's become a leading voice in protecting voters from deceptive election practices and improving election cybersecurity and campaign finance disclosure. He holds degrees from Georgetown and USC, but here at the UC Center Sacramento, we won't hold either of those against him. And we are thrilled to have Assemblymember Mark Berman.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kauser, and to your colleagues for the opportunity to participate in today's really important discussion. And I didn't realize that you had done a survey on some of the reforms that Senator Umberg and I and our colleagues have been doing. So I'm now nervous for the rest of the webinar and to find out what Californians actually think about the work that we've been doing. As I was preparing my talking points and discussing recent reforms with Ethan Jones, the chief consultant to the Assembly Elections Committee, I realized that California has unintentionally adopted many policies that prepared us quite well to operate an accessible, safe, and secure presidential election in the middle of a once-a-century global health pandemic. I don't use the word unintentional to imply we were lucky. California has been very intentional over the last decade in adopting cutting-edge policies which were designed to reduce barriers to voting, give voters additional options for how they vote, and ensure that voters' ballots are counted. These policies made our election system more resilient to both anticipated and unanticipated challenges. Even before COVID-19, the 2020 election cycle already was going to be unlike any other in California history. Due in part to the California New Motor Voter Act, California's voter registration levels have reached rates that California hasn't seen since World War II. Furthermore, with the implementation of the California Voters' Choice Act in counties comprising more than half the state's registered voters, the state was already relying on vote-by-mail ballots for our elections more than ever before. Since we already had much of the infrastructure in place, it was much easier to ramp up vote-by-mail voting in California in response to COVID-19 and get support in the legislature and among county elections officials for efforts like my bill, AB 860, which required that every active registered voter in California be sent a ballot in the mail. And all the voter registrations and re-registrations that have occurred as a result of the California New Motor Voter Act have helped ensure that the state has more accurate and up-to-date voter registration rolls, which is essential when we're mailing a ballot to all active registered voters. Other recently enacted policies have also helped ensure that California is able to conduct a successful presidential general election during the middle of a pandemic while keeping voters, election workers, and the public safe. The Secretary of State's ballot tracking service, which was established pursuant to AB 2218 in 2018, is an important part of increasing voters' confidence in vote-by-mail voting. Again, this has a bit unintentionally become very important in 2020. We always meant it as a tool to increase transparency in the voting process and to increase trust in our democracy. But when I authored the bill over 2 years ago to create this process, I did not anticipate that the President of the United States would wage an all-out misinformation campaign, spreading lies about voting by mail and creating mistrust in our communities. In light of these efforts, the Where's My Ballot service increases confidence among voters that they can vote from the safety of their own home. This in turn decreases the number of people who vote in person, which increases the safety of those who prefer to or must vote in person and of the elections workers themselves. Finally, we've also passed legislation to increase the likelihood that a vote will be counted, even if a problem occurs in the voting process. Recently enacted legislation that ensures that voters have a chance to correct any problems with the signature on their vote-by-mail ballot envelope will help maximize the number of ballots that are counted. In addition, as we saw last week with the issue of the unauthorized ballot drop boxes placed in some counties, legislation passed in 2016 ensures that even if the intermediary that collects and delivers the ballots does not properly complete the information on the ballot envelope, the voter is not penalized and their ballot will still be counted. So in the end, while we weren't necessarily anticipating holding the most important election of our lifetime during a global pandemic when we were considering these bills in the last few years, the policies nonetheless put the state in a much better position to conduct a successful election this November. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Professor, and look forward to hearing the wisdom from my colleague in the Senate, Senator Umberg.
Great. Thanks so much for those important remarks, Assemblymember Berman, and for all of your efforts in California. And I just wanted to note, since you mentioned the Where's My Ballot tracking tool, that many of the projects that are presented here come from the New Electorate Project, which is a UC-led study. And one of the things that we're doing this fall is sending voters information about the Where's My Ballot tracking tool. A random sample, about 100,000 voters will receive that. And then another 100,000 voters will receive information about the safeguards that the Secretary of State puts in place to make sure that there isn't fraud in voting by mail. And then we're going to look to see the effect of that on trust in elections and on voter turnout. So anyone can find any of the results of past studies and our upcoming studies at our website at newelectorateproject.org. All right.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Great. Now I have the pleasure of introducing State Senator Tom Umberg, who is a retired U.S. Army colonel, a former federal career prosecutor with a 100% conviction rate, a small business owner, and was the deputy drug czar for President Clinton. Senator Umberg served 3 terms in the state assembly, where he represented Central Orange County. He worked across party lines, authoring 76 laws and bringing more than $563 million in funds to Orange County. In the Senate, his focus has been on continuing to work to keep our communities safe while also protecting the rights of workers, immigrants, and women who deserve to be free from harassment and intimidation. He chairs the Senate Elections and Constitutional Amendments Committee and has authored some of the most important recent bills on California's electoral system. Thanks so much for being here, Senator Umberg.
Thank you, Professor. I appreciate that. And I hope you'll note the colors that I'm wearing. Unlike Assemblyman Berman, the Umberg family has 5 UC graduates, and I'm wearing UC colors for that purpose today. A couple things. One, I want to both thank and congratulate Assemblymember Berman for his leadership on election law here over the course of the last 2 years. We've had some real challenges, and Assemblyman Berman has really been a leader in that area. And we're supported by our staffs. I see Mr. Jones, Mr. Ethan Jones is on, and I think Mr. Darren Chesson is on. And I won't speak for Mark, but I'll speak for myself, is that they certainly make me look a lot smarter than I am. So I want to thank them. A couple other things. We've had this pandemic, which has created all sorts of additional challenges, both in terms of elections and just governing in general. But there's a historic tension that exists with respect to elections that's existed for the last couple hundred years. And that's the tension between those who want to restrict the kinds of people that can vote and the enfranchisement and the franchise, and those who want to expand it. You may not be able to tell, but I'm an old white guy, actually a landowner. So my kind has been able to vote for the last couple hundred years. That's not true of most Americans. And that tension continues today. I mean, you can see it in places like North Carolina, like Mississippi. You can see it as questions come before the Supreme Court right now. Fortunately, in California, those who are influential in policymaking have a more expansive view. As Assemblymember Berman pointed out, that we want every eligible voter to be able to cast their ballot. We want every eligible voter to be registered. And so we want to create a facility for just that. The other tension that exists, and Assemblymember Berman has been quite active in this area, and that's the tension between transparency and privacy. Transparency in, for example, who's donating to whom, or initiatives, or independent expenditure campaigns, the tension between full transparency and privacy. And that continues to play out. And fortunately, I think that certainly Assemblymember Berman and I believe in greater transparency. But those issues, both those issues, are going to continue to play out for a very, very long time, because those tensions will continue to exist. Along those lines, Assemblymember Berman indicated the legislation that he authored and championed. There are a couple other pieces of legislation that I wanted to mention. One from actually last year, SB 72. SB 72 provides that you can register at your polling place or your vote center all the way, once they're open, even on election day, you can register to vote, provided you're an eligible registered voter here, or an eligible voter in California, which again expands the opportunity for folks to exercise their franchise. Also, I think it's an excellent idea, particularly right now in light of the pandemic, to make sure that everybody receives a ballot that they can safely either drop off in a drop box or mail in. But there are some people who simply can't do that, either because they have a disability, or they may have a language challenge, or they want to register to vote at a polling place on election day. And in order to make sure they've lost their ballot or something else has happened, we authored SB 423, which provides for in-person voting, so that every voter in California can, if they should choose, we actually encourage people to vote earlier, but if they choose, that they can vote in person in a way that's very safe, so that the polls have separate lines, for example, for those who decide that for whatever reason they refuse to wear a mask, so that they are kept separate from those who are wearing masks. And certainly the poll workers will have appropriate PPE appropriate protection and also be sanitizing the voting facility before and after each person votes. We also, now this has been longstanding in California, is that we have some other protections, that we have a paper trail for every person, for every ballot that's cast. We have a paper trail, and we also, one of the issues that's arisen is the ability for others who want to interfere in our election to be able to hack into our systems. Our systems that are run by the registrars of voters in each county do not connect to the internet. In fact, it's illegal to have them connect to the internet just to prevent that kind of interference. One other thing I should mention is a bill that moves the primary in non-presidential election years from March till June. And that was my bill, and co-authored by Assemblymember Berman. The purpose of that is severalfold. One is that in 2022, because we're going to have redistricting, which is an exercise that occurs every 10 years after the census, the folks who are doing redistricting aren't going to have the data to be able to adequately do the redistricting in order to have an election in March. But that will continue in besides 2022, will continue in 2026 in other non-presidential years. And it was my view that shortening the election cycle actually would reduce the cost of elections. The longer the cycle is, the more expensive elections are, and the greater barrier there is for folks to basically run for office. And then also it shortens the time so that we don't have voter fatigue. The sort of continual elections or continual electioneering can lead to voter fatigue, and we don't want that. That's not good for public policy. It's not good for the body politic. So those are some of the things that we've been focused on, and we'll continue to focus on. And then lastly, thank you. Thank you for putting together this seminar, and thank you for your academic work in this area. That's so important, so that we have the tools to be able to carry on in the way that we want to in terms of increasing the franchise, increasing transparency, that kind of thing. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you both for those wonderful remarks. I'm Cheryl Boudreau. I'm a professor at UC Davis, and I wanted to introduce the academic portion of today's webinar. So I wanted to just provide a brief overview of our panel before we get started. So by way of background, for the last several years, researchers from across the UC system have been collaborating with each other, with other institutions like the Public Policy Institute of California, and consulting with policymakers to study the effects of electoral reforms in California. So this upcoming panel will highlight findings that our team has produced and that they've published. So we'll start off the panel with polling data that's hot off the presses. The survey is actually still in the field, that's examining public opinion about California's decision to mail all registered voters a ballot for this November's election. After that, we'll turn to summaries of articles that were recently published in a special issue of the California Journal of Politics and Policy. So this issue was co-edited by Thad Kauser from UCSD and myself, and it showcases some of the research that's come out of our collaborations. So the publications include a wide range of topics that you'll hopefully find of interest. Today, we'll hear about the effects of concurrent elections on the composition of the electorate, the effects of different kinds of mobilization messages on racial and ethnic minorities and their propensity to participate in politics, and then how Californians prefer to cast their ballots in light of the pandemic. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our first speaker, Ben Heyton from UC Davis, who will present the results of our poll that examines how people feel about California's decision to mail all voters a ballot. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. As Cheryl said, I'm Ben Heyton. I'm a political science professor at UC Davis, and I'm going to share with you some polling results that we are in the process of collecting. And to get started, let me just share my screen so everyone can see what it is that I'm talking about. So the survey that I'm going to talk about is part of this broad project called the New Electorate Project that aims to look at a whole variety of new electoral reforms in California and provides systematic evidence regarding a wide range of questions that come up around that. It's been funded by the University of California's Office of the President. We have faculty members across all the UC campuses, virtually all the UC campuses participating, along with collaborators also from USC and the Public Policy Institute of California. As Thad said earlier, there's a website where you can find all the material related to the project, and that is at the newelectorateproject.org. What I want to talk about today is a survey that we currently have in the field. It's been in the field for about a week or so and will be in the field for about another several days. We have collaborators across some of the UC campuses, including Seth Hill and Thad at UCSD, Jessica Tronstein at UC Merced, Jen Marola from Riverside, and Dan Biggers also from Riverside. What I'm going to talk about shortly are some of the results from the UC Davis module that I've been working on with Cheryl Boudreau, who you just met, and one of our graduate students, Sam Collett. And what I do want to emphasize is that word that's in red. These are preliminary results because the survey is not yet done. And so we're analyzing the data that we already have, but we would not call them final by any means. In particular, what I want to focus on is an overall assessment of AB 860, which has to do, of course, with the decision to mail vote by mail ballots to all registered voters in California for this fall's election. In particular, after giving respondents in the survey a general description of the policy, we asked them this question: all things considered, how do you feel about the decision to send vote by mail ballots to all registered voters in California for this election? Based on the data that we've already collected, we have 14% of the respondents who somewhat or strongly oppose it, 17% of the respondents who indicate that they neither support nor oppose it or answer don't know. And as you will see, a very clear majority of respondents either somewhat or strongly support the policy. Together, that of course adds up to 100%. And what we're going to be focusing on in these next slides are what we call net support. So we take the percentage who somewhat or strongly support, subtract off the percentage who somewhat or strongly oppose. And in this case, that tells us that net support for the policy is 55%. Any value that's greater than 0 indicates that there are more supporters than opposers. And I will say right here at the outset that across all the groups that we've analyzed, there is net positive support. But as you also see, there is variation across some groups. So let's turn straight to some of the results. We'll start with net support by race and ethnicity. Currently, we have enough respondents to separate out white non-Hispanics from Hispanics and from other racial groups. As the survey continues in the field, we hope to be able to separate out African Americans and Asian Americans, but for the time being, they are in that other group. If we look at what the results tell us, we see that between white non-Hispanics and Hispanics, net support is right between 50 and 60%, and there's barely any difference between the two, with modestly lower support among those other categories, those other racial and ethnic categories. And as I said, at this point, we can't separate out those other categories to tell you if that's being driven largely by one particular other group, be they African Americans, Asian Americans, or some other group. So that's what we're seeing with respect to race and ethnicity. We can also look at net support by age. And here we have people broken out into 4 age groups. It's driven as much by where we have respondents filling these categories as by the ideal age groups we would look at. What you can see is between the 18 to 25-year-olds up to the 36 to 50-year-olds, there is increasing net support for the vote by mail policy, going up from about 50% to 60%. And then somewhat counterintuitively, at least to me, we see lower support among those aged 51 and older. My intuition would have been that this demographic, which traditionally has the highest vote by mail rates, would have been the most supportive. It remains to be seen if, when we're done collecting the data, if that will be the case, and if it's not, what might explain it. But for the time being, as we see increasing support up until those aged 50 and over, and there we see some decreasing support. The next chart I want to look at looks at support by educational attainment. Here we have people broken out into 3 categories: those who have a high school degree or less, those who have some college attendance but not a 4-year college degree, and those who have graduated college. And what you can see is that support is highest among the college graduates, with net support at about 60%, but there's not a whole lot of variation here, and it certainly isn't systematically increasing or decreasing with age. Next, we have the largest gap that we see, and this is perhaps not surprising. When we separate our respondents out by partisan identity, Democrats versus Republicans, we see overwhelming net support among Democrats, almost 80%. Republicans are still net supportive. That is, more people support than oppose the policy, but their net support is closer to 30%, giving us a nearly 50-point gap between Democrats and Republicans. And as I said, this was expected, though perhaps not to be this large, and it is the largest gap that we see in the data so far. The last gap that I want to show you has to do with gender. And at least for me, this also is unanticipated. When we break out our respondents by gender, we see that women are less supportive than men, from about 50% among women to a little bit over 60% for men. To me, this is counterintuitive for at least one reason, which is women are more likely to be Democrats. And as we just saw, Democrats are more supportive than Republicans. It turns out both of those patterns can exist. And that's what we'll see here in this last slide that I have for you, which is this gender gap is apparent for both Democrats and Republicans, among both men and women. So as you'll see in the left 2 bars where we focus on men, Democrats have that very high support we've seen, but we see Democratic men are now approaching 90% net support. Republican men, on the other hand, have that significantly lower support of nearly 40%. When we turn to women, we see that Democratic women certainly have greater support than Republican women, but at the same time, Democratic women have less support than Democratic men, and Republicans who are women have notably less support than Republicans who are men. And as you see, it is Republican women who are the closest to net support of 0 across all the groups that we have looked at. That is, it is among Republican women that supporters are just barely outnumbering opposers across this survey question. Let me just wrap up by saying that not only is the survey still in the field and we're still collecting data on that question, we're also asking a host of other questions related to the upcoming election. We're asking about perceptions of fraud. We're asking about legitimacy of the election. We're trying to find out just people's likelihood of voting and how that might relate to their views of AB 860. And then we're not looking at partisan advantage per se, but we are looking at perceptions of partisan advantage. That is, we all know that there's a lot of rhetoric out there about which partisan groups might be advantaged or disadvantaged by a whole host of policies that are out there. We're interested with this question in figuring out and finding out if ordinary voters' opinions are rooted in beliefs about partisan advantage for one side or the other. And with that, let me stop sharing my screen and turn it on to the next presenter. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Tronstein. I'm a professor of political science at UC Merced. And I'm going to tell you about an article that is just published today at CJPP that I co-authored with 2 of my colleagues, Eddie Lucero and Jonathan Collins. So as most all of you who are turning in to this webinar know, Governor Brown signed the California Voter Participation Rights Act, SB 415, into law in 2015. As the title suggests, the bill aimed to increase turnout in local elections by forcing all California jurisdictions to hold elections concurrently with statewide elections in either June or November of even years. So what's this all about? Well, nationally, turnout in local elections is significantly lower than national turnout, averaging only 20% by some estimates. But scholars have shown that holding local elections concurrently with national elections can significantly boost participation. But we still don't know all that much about who turns out to vote in concurrent versus non-concurrent elections. And that's what we set out to figure out in this research note. So we use a large survey of California residents that was funded by the UC Office of the President to ask whether concurrent elections are likely to alter the composition of the electorate. We begin by comparing respondents' answers to questions about voting in local and national elections. We find that most people who vote in local elections also vote in national elections. But interestingly, the inverse is not true. That is, there are a lot of people who vote for president, but then don't turn out in mayoral elections. So we conclude that local voters can be considered a subset of national voters. So then we ask, does this subset look different? Does it look different from the national electorate? And to do this, we compare the demographic characteristics of people who say that they always vote in local elections to those who say that they vote in national elections. What we find is that compared to national voters, local electorates are comprised of voters who are more likely to be permanent residents, more likely to be over the age of 45, more likely to be male, have strong partisan affiliations, be highly educated, and feel efficacious, feel that they have power in the political system. And they're less likely to be Latino. So we interpret these findings to conclude that election timing could substantially change the makeup of local electorates. Finally, we sought to explore the reasons that people choose not to participate in local elections, even when they do participate in national elections. So we asked people a series of different statements to agree or disagree with a series of different statements about why people like them may or may not vote in certain kinds of elections. And we find several factors explain differences between national and local voting. Knowledge about when the election is held. It's no surprise that everybody knows when the presidential election is held, but not everybody knows when the mayoral election is held, right? Not feeling qualified to choose candidates. If you don't know who you're going to vote for in the presidential election, you've definitely been taking a nap. But you might not know who to vote for in the mayoral election because there's a lot less information. And believing that other people will do just as good of a job at picking the winners or the candidates compared to you. So we interpret all of these findings to suggest that a lack of procedural information and a lack of internal efficacy, feeling efficacious about the political process, are drivers of lower turnout at the local level. So this year, it's very exciting, the requirements of SB 415 are in full effect. And after the election, we'll have an even better chance to study whether moving local races to coincide with the presidential election matters for who votes and who wins. And we have a series of projects that are planned for later on this year, and we're excited to report back on our findings once we've done that research. So I'm going to sign off now and turn it over to Professor Jennifer Marola, who's going to tell you about her article.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm going to share a few slides. I'm going to pull those up right now. I'm a professor at the University of California, Riverside, and I'll also be sharing an article that's in the current issue of the CJPP. And in this article, it's entitled Messaging Matters: How Information About Underrepresentation Affects the Political Participation of Racial and Ethnic Groups in California. And this is co-authored with Cheryl Boudreau, who you heard from earlier, and Sono Shah from the Pew Research Center. And I just want to motivate the project a bit. I want to take us back to the 2016 election. And during this time on my commute out to UC Riverside, I would drive on 60 East to get there because I live in Claremont. And there was this billboard that was posted right on the freeway. And this is what it said. So over 50% of the United States is female, but only 20% of Congress is female, right? And so this is something that really certainly got my attention. I study women in politics, so I was well aware of these statistics, but it made me think, you know, there may be women who are not aware about this underrepresentation, and this may really, you know, kind of get their attention. and make them think that, perhaps more women need to be engaged in the political system to kind of alter these percentages. And so what we were interested in this project was to look at whether a similar type of message would have any effect in increasing the political engagement of racial and ethnic minorities in California. As many of you know, the presence of racial and ethnic minorities in the electorate is lower than their presence in the population. And so that was really our main motivation. And we were interested in whether this type of message about underrepresentation would have effects different from kind of a standard get out the vote message that campaigns often use. Right now, we really don't know much from existing scholarship what type of effect this message will have on the electorate. And we also were interested in looking at, does this matter differently for different groups and even within groups? So for example, you might imagine that people who are already aware of underrepresentation, this may not really have much effect on their likelihood of engaging. However, for people who are unaware of these statistics, right, they may be more likely to learn new information and it may affect their subsequent behavior. And so what we did was we designed a two-wave online panel study. So this is a survey-based design. And we sampled Asians, Blacks, and Latinx respondents in California. We also had a slight oversample of Asians and Blacks at the national level. And we wanted to do our study in two different waves. So in our first wave, we really wanted to get a sense of how aware people are of underrepresentation. And we found that a non-trivial percentage of individuals from all of these groups that we look at were not aware that they were underrepresented either in state government or national government. And then about a week later, we had people come back, and in that survey, we randomly assigned them to different types of messages. So we had a control group that didn't get any message about voting. Instead, they were encouraged to recycle. In another group, they received kind of a standard get out the vote message, reminding them of the election and encouraging them to vote. And then finally, we designed a treatment kind of very similar to that billboard about the underrepresentation of an individual's group in state government for Asians and Latinx respondents, or at the national level for Black respondents. And then we asked them a whole series of questions, both their likelihood of voting, so this was in the context of the 2018 election, and then engagement in activities beyond voting. And so I just want to highlight a few of the findings from that study. So first, one really important thing, I guess, before I go over these results is we don't find any effects on respondents' likelihood of turnout, right? So none of our different, kind of messages altered the likelihood of voting, right? So, at least on that very basic question, we really don't find any differences across the different messages, and it doesn't vary whether people are aware or unaware of underrepresentation. But we also asked other questions in the survey, and so one that you're looking at on this slide, we gave people the opportunity to send a message to their US senators. And so what we look at is whether they actually filled out, say, a little kind of postcard online, whether they wanted a message sent to their senators. And the key finding that we find, and this is among Asians and Latinx respondents, is that when people were unaware of underrepresentation and they were exposed to write that message that I told you about, making them aware, it actually made them less likely to contact their senators. Right? So instead of finding a mobilizing effect, instead we find kind of a demobilizing type of effect. Now, this was just among Asian and Latinx respondents. We also asked questions about the likelihood that people would engage in politics in the future. And here we find an effect that was probably more along the lines of what IamAvoter.com had in mind when they posted the billboard. Among Black respondents who are unaware of underrepresentation, when they were exposed to our message, they became more likely to engage in future activities. And so that's kind of more in line with what we expected to find, across groups. And so we think there are a few key takeaways. First is that, messages don't necessarily work the same way across all groups of voters. They don't necessarily work for all, the same types of engagement activities. And so we think these results suggest that it's really important for organizations to pilot test their messages before they implement them in kind of big get out the vote efforts, either going door to door or sending messages, and certainly posting billboards. So with that, I'll turn it over to our next speaker, Mindy Romero, who'll be sharing another article in the journal.
Okay, make sure everybody can hear me okay. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk today also about a CJPP new article titled, "How Do Californians want to cast their ballots during the time of COVID. My co-authors are authors from UC San Diego and UC Riverside, Mackenzie Lockhart, Seth Hill, and Jennifer Morola. And just jumping in, as the name suggests, asking about people's method of voting, their preferences around that was a driving research question for us on this study. We also asked other questions, though, which you can find when you look at the article itself. We asked what changes in the electoral process would they support California voters. Eligible voters actually was our sample size. That's adult citizens. What changes would they support during this kind of critical time, right, during COVID? How would reforms in the 2020 election cycle reshape our electorate possibly into the future? And to examine these questions, we also conducted a survey, a rather diverse, robust survey of 12,000 plus eligible voters in California online and the time of that was early to mid-April. And the results, pretty striking. No surprise, I think, at this point, given some of the other research we've heard today, but that overwhelmingly voters in California, eligible voters, stated that they want to use their vote by mail ballots. The question was just the method that they wanted to use. So with our survey, 52%, and again, this is prior to the election, right? Number of months kind of leading up to it, but post the onset of COVID. 52% said they wanted to send their vote by mail ballot through the mail. Another almost 19% said they wanted to drop off their vote by mail ballot. And that's important because that's still an in-person experience to some degree. There's reasons why people, of course, we know from other research why people want to drop off their ballot. And 30% said, even in the time of COVID, knowing that they have available to them a vote by mail ballot to send through the mail or drop off, 30% said they still wanted to vote in person. And there were differences by race, ethnicity that we found as well. So Latinos, for instance, were more likely, and also African Americans, excuse me for the beep on my computer, and African Americans also wanting to vote in higher likelihoods, larger percentages wanting to vote in person rather than sending or dropping off that vote by mail ballot. So that's important to note as well. We also conducted an experimental treatment as part of the study, wanting to know what the impact of scientific projections could be on people's likelihood or of voting method. So in a nutshell, we found that for those voters that were exposed, that received messaging that COVID could be at a peak, and you may remember back in March, April, May, June, and we were all talking about wondering exactly what the trajectory of COVID could be. Will it be peaking in November? Could it be peaking in the following spring? And we gave those options to voters. We presented different voter groups and a control group with different scenarios. Those that received the scenario that COVID would be peaking in November were also more likely to say that they were going to vote by mail. So aside from that, we also asked voters about their comfort level in standing in line at a polling place or vote center, and also at potentially volunteering as a polling worker, on election day or leading up to election day. And across the board, there were concerns about that, but once voters, and this is across the board in terms of race, ethnicity, and age, once voters were told that there would be standards in place to assure protection around COVID, like use of PPE and social distancing, the percentage of respondents that said they would be comfortable standing in line or volunteering at a polling place went up quite substantially. For most groups, it was near around 20 percentage points of an increase. So that told us that it wasn't just important to have PPE and social distancing in place, but the voters needed to be aware of it, right? That's part of the messaging that was critical for this election cycle. The voters were being told, right? And in a sense, assured or reassured that they would have a safe voting experience. And then lastly, we also in the survey identified that there was strong support for a number of policies expanding access to vote by mail, policies such as no excuse vote by mail, allowing everyone to get a ballot that requests one. There were some differences by race, ethnicity, most notably for Latinos being much more supportive of access to VBM if requesting one, but across the board, strong support. And I think I will leave it there for time. Thank you very much. I'll pass on over to my colleagues.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Romero, and all of the authors. And I wanted to note that now we're about to move into the Q&A section. We still have both of our state legislators with us. So, so this is your opportunity, audience members, to ask them questions or ask any of the panelists questions. Thanks so much for doing that. Before we do that, I want to just tell you a little bit more about this journal and hand things over to the folks who've led the rejuvenation of this journal at California State University, Sacramento. But I just wanted to briefly give a quick shout out to 3 of our audience members who are also authors of CJPP pieces. So Christina Fleets Romo is the lead author of the ACLU of California's piece, which details some of the legal fights that they have undertaken to protect the vote in California this year. Elizabeth Mitchell, a PhD candidate at Berkeley, led an article that brought together both a survey and a Get Out the Vote field experiment to determine then address the concerns that lead to various, to many low participation groups in California, and trying to uncover the barriers to participation by those groups. And then Mackenzie Lockhart, a PhD candidate at UCSD, was a co-author of several of the articles that involved surveys, and was also the lead author of a recent piece coming out of the New Electorate Project that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, showing the increasing polarization nationally between the 2 parties on voting by mail. So thanks so much to all of them, and congrats for their contributions. And now I will turn things over to Leonore Elling and Ted Lasher at Sacramento State.
Well, I don't know if Professor Lasher is on, but I just wanted to sort of announce to folks that the journal will be housed now at Sac State. Professor Lasher will be the managing editor. Did you want to say something, Professor Lasher?
Yeah, well, first of all, welcome everybody. And so I want to say that I'm very excited to do this, and because I've thought for a long time that this journal fills a niche that really isn't filled by any other journal. And I particularly want to thank my colleague Leonore in the Center for California Studies for their willingness to take over the sort of lead administrative responsibility. We're really excited about doing this. We're particularly excited because as recently as a year ago, it looked like this journal might just go away. Because the Institute of Governmental Studies at Berkeley has many, many responsibilities, just didn't have the capacity to keep doing this with everything else that they have. We worked together with them, and now we're able to move the journal over here. We put together, I think, a really excellent editorial board of both academics and practitioners, a couple of whom are in the room. And all of this will get this opportunity to do these kinds of things that I think are so wonderful. And thanks to Thad and to Cheryl and all of you for doing that. One other thing I'd note quickly before we move on to questions and answers is we're really thinking about where exactly the journal should go. We know we're going to have academic articles. We know we're going to have some other more practitioner-oriented things, but we're still trying to figure that out. And we're going to have a meeting of the editorial board about this next month. So if you have ideas, or if you've got ideas for articles, contact me. I like to think that I have one of the shortest emails in the Western world, tedl@csus.edu. So if you've got ideas or anything like that, contact me. Thanks.
Excellent, and thanks so much, Sacramento State, for your support of this great institution. And now we're going to end the recording so that we can so that we can use we don't have any privacy concerns over people asking questions. I see some great questions in this, and I see the first 2 questions are really about the policy